Hi, this is Amelia Lyons, clinical supervisor trainer at the Aneurin Bevan Health Board. Today, as part of the supervision program, we are going to look at the Tietze method, which is looking at facilitating peer supervision groups. So what is peer group supervision? Well, Tietze describes it as an effective form of leaderless peer group consulting. So unlike the other supervision models we've been looking at, Tietze comes from an organisational psychology background, and this model is aimed at organisations out there in the business world, whereas we're looking at it from the sort of caring sector and the health sector. So, but it's interesting to include a business model in that sense, and it will be interesting to compare that with the models that we're looking at on the programme. So Tietze talks about it as having a range of advantages in organisations, new ideas, new perspectives, reflection on one's own management style, exchange between colleagues and learning across the organisation, enhanced team cooperation, and so on. And not only does the peer group have benefits for the individual, but also for the organisational culture, enhancing organisational learning, cross-divisional learning, preventing silo thinking, and so on. You know, quite efficient and quite positive in that sense. And again, we'd see these as applying to any decent supervision group running within an organisation. But it needs to be a large organisation, because otherwise things might become, you might get a sort of preventative groupthink going on that might be could be problematic. And then he talks about the conditions for peer group supervision. And again, we'd sort of look at these in relation to clinical group supervision in various ways. And he talks about 4 key ingredients: trust, confidence, confidentiality, support and appreciation within the group. He talks about the group should be without any greater internal conflicts, which I think is a bit naive, as in any organisation that's been working together for a while, there'll always be interpersonal conflicts. So it's kind of like, how do we work with them rather than denying that they exist? And to say that they should not be affected by interpersonal tension is, again, naive, I think. So the group, he talks about, if necessary, the group should settle internal conflicts with the assistance of an external counsellor, clinical supervisor, maybe a mediator. And sometimes that's possible, and sometimes something bigger is called for. And to those attitudes and conditions, we'd add those sorts of other aspects like respect, there being a kind of an emphasis on everyone taking part, that there's a commitment to the group, willingness to give and receive feedback, you know, and setting up how long you meet for, when, and all of those kind of housekeeping issues that are important to clarify at the start of groups. So then Tietze talks about group size, being around 6 to 9. Cases get presented. He's specific about the roles in the group. So you've got consultant, presenter and facilitator or moderator. And also he has a scribe role, somebody to take notes as required, and says that each case takes 30 to 40 minutes to talk about. And within that, so you've got your structured roles and you've also got your phases. So you decide the roles first of all, and the facilitator is usually agreed first, because then they ask the group, well, who's going to present? And that sort of then falls out. The other roles then fall out of that. The presentation itself, which is expected to take about 5 to 7 minutes. There's a key question that the presenter needs to have thought about, and they might need some help with this with the group. So there's a phase in the group that involves looking at the question. There's the choice of the method, so that is left to the presenter in this model. And then the consultation, which happens, so after the question is agreed, We have a scribe. The consultation process takes place, and then we have a conclusion and some action points perhaps, and facilitators get some feedback at the end of that process. Then the group briefly reflects on the process itself, and then it moves on. So here Tietze focuses on the importance of identifying a specific question to take to the group that you'd like to explore. So it should be simple and brief. He argues 10 words or less, and try and identify that before you come. So it may focus on an aspect of your clinical work, the impact of your work and team, how something's relating to you, issues with colleagues, issues with professional practice, and so on. But a good supervision question helps to focus the discussion and makes it more time effective. And then at this stage, it's quite important to, perhaps take a little exercise where you identify a supervision question with a partner, and try and get really specific about what it is that's bothering you that you'd really like to explore today. So you can sort of think about it, write it out spontaneously, and then have a conversation with a partner and get them to help you to focus. And then once you're happy with the question, you can rate the temperature of your question. Now, what I'd say about that is, for example, we can often come into supervision with a long story about this happened to me and he said and she said, and I didn't know what to do, and I tried to call them out about something, and then they just criticised the way that I did it rather than actually responded to what I was talking about. And you go on and on and on. Whereas a focused way of asking that might be, how do I call somebody out about something without antagonising them? And that might be a really useful question to ask. Now, is the question too hot? In other words, are you still very passionate and perhaps a little bit irrational about it still at the moment? Or is it that it is warm enough, you've got energy to discuss it, it's still sort of current for you, but it's not so cold that it feels very distant now and you don't really relate to that question anymore. So it's finding a question of sufficient sort of energy, really, that you've got to explore it. And Tietze describes that in temperature terms. Now, Tietze describes a list of methods. Now, unfortunately, his book has never been translated from German to English, at least not to my knowledge. I have had a look for it from time to time. So I think he gives a range of methods, but I've only seen a few in articles written by him that have been translated. So you've got his methods, and then you've got some methods that, in my experience in supervision, I've also added to the table. So written it out as follows. So the sort of brainstorming, kind of get everything down sort of method. He also talks about role play and act storming. So, for example, in that question that we talked about, calling out without antagonising, perhaps the consultants there could act that out a bit and show the scenario in a few different ways so that the individual asking the question could see, that's how I didn't know you could do it like that, and that sort of thing. You get to know it. A sculpt, so that's something that, one might do with buttons, or you might get people, if the group's large enough, to sort of stand, or perhaps just get a couple of individuals to stand in a sort of conflicting stance and invite them to talk about how they feel. Those sorts of ideas. Tietze talks about a sounding board, reflective, so you can think about that in a person-centered way, listen with empathy, and reflect back the feelings and things that you're hearing, and aim to get as close as possible to how the supervisee feels and how they see the situation. So the Rogerian notion there being, the closer you get to that, the more the supervisee will be able to sort of see themselves and decide for themselves where the change is best placed, sort of thing. Free association, so I might consider that a sort of Balint type method where the consultants would free associate to what the story that they'd heard and might come up with images and feelings and imaginative ways of thinking about the situation. So to service what's not being spoken about in that sense. So that would be that kind of method. Mindful replay might be sort of the consultants thinking back over what they've heard and sharing how each sort of moment felt in that situation. When Amelia said that, I felt my stomach tighten, etc. Identification and self-disclosure via fireside stories. So sometimes the person may say a story, and instead of answering the question directly, you might come up with another story. So something that you've heard in the story that you resonate with, and just say the story, obviously keeping it sort of reasonably brief. But, for example, in the story about calling out and antagonizing, one might think of a story where one had been called out and how one felt, or another situation where one had been antagonized or something like that. But there might have been aspects within the story also that you heard that triggered something. So that might be another story that might come out of that situation. Art, music, creative, non-verbal intervention. So somebody might do a mime of what they've heard, or they might draw it, or say, when I hear that, I'm reminded of a particular song, and sing it. And that may be a method that one might use. Flipping the question. So that's, again, from Tietze. So that's about, you might say, what was helpful about what I did with somebody. And a way of flipping that question might be to say, well, what would an unhelpful intervention look like? Or when you talk about sort of calling out, what would calling in look like? What would including look like? So you might find different ways of turning the question around to consider what's being discussed in that sense. Good pieces of advice, and that's fairly straightforward. Or consultant's choice. So in that sense, often Tietze says or advises that the presenter chooses the method. And so what I'm putting to you there is, well, maybe actually sometimes it's useful for the consultants to choose the method. They might think, I really want to act this out, or I really want to do a sculpt on this, or show you in a way. So to almost invite the consultants there to use their imaginations, a bit like going into the hairdresser. You might say, well, I want my hair cut exactly like this. Or you might say, why don't you do something and see what comes out of that? So the bottom line is here really is that there's a kind of menu of methods, and that the consultants and the presenter, whoever it might be, chooses from those list of methods. And then you take it from there. So then when we actually get down to using the method, the case presenter shares their initial question with the group. They talk about their question and what's behind that for a few minutes, answer some clarifying questions from the consultant and facilitator. and finally confirms their question then. So, in other words, some of the clarifying questions might be sort of flipping the question and looking at the question as part of the overall presentation. And then, as Tietze advocates, that the presenter asks for a type of intervention that they want from the group, and then sits back and listens to the consultant's discussion. Now, what we've found in practice, and we've done this over quite a few years now with our supervision groups, is that we found quite often there's an opportunity, depends on the method that's been picked, to use two methods in the time that we have available. And so sometimes we say presenter pick one method and the consultant's another. And so that, I think, takes care of sort of both sides. Sometimes presenters can slip into just asking for things like advice. And then the process becomes very quick. You know, people come out with their advice, which is usually pretty quick. And then there's like, well, we've got another 15 minutes here. What are we going to do with it? So that's what's made us really explore other methods and try to veer away really from the good pieces of advice, because it just tends to shut down the conversation. But anyway, after the presentation and the discussion is over, we've tended not so much to use a scribe, but it may be something that could be used or couldn't be used. Just don't want to slow down the process too much by the scribe sort of laboriously going through everything that was said and this and that sort of thing. But if we can just get to a couple of action points or a couple of things that the presenter needs to, decides that they're going to think about further after the discussion, then that's something that the scribe can usefully do. Everybody gets thanked for their support at the end, and that concludes the presentation. So what's nice about this model here is that there's also attention to the leadership of the group and or the moderation or the facilitation, depends which way you like to see it, in terms of perhaps the culture of the supervision group as a whole. So we got some attention to what that role does, with opening and closing the session, holding the boundaries of the time, invites clarification. Again, Tietze sort of focuses on the sort of two-layered thing. Is the question okay? Is that really asking what is something useful for the individual presenting? Does it need to be honed a bit further? Which could also be part of that process. And then a kind of second tier of the process is then looking at the question itself and what comes from that. So then the presenter is invited to select one method and the consultants to select another. So that's kind of where we've arrived at in running the course over a number of years, is that actually why not give both parties a choice there and let's see what comes out. Let's try and really be creative with it. And then we invite the presenter back in for a few minutes before the end just to get their thoughts. And the facilitator guides the group from one stage to another. And they bring the session to a close, and at that stage there's no more discussion about the question. But of course there's a few minutes to look at the facilitator and to look at some feedback, offering some feedback for them. So then if we look at the roles of the consultants, obviously their role is to follow the instructions of the facilitator, carefully listen to the presenter clearly during the case presentation, and ask some clarifying questions at the beginning under the guidance of the facilitator. And then again, another sort of variation that we've sort of looked at is inviting them to select and debate methods. So, another useful thing as part of the supervision contemplation really is to think about the methods, and what is the merit of using one method over another. And, there could be the possibility of exploring that further as being a very useful conversation. But then a method will get chosen, and as I say, we may even have time to look at two methods. And the consultants don't evaluate, question, or contest comments from another, but instead actively listen to each other's reflections and perspectives in a non-judgmental way. So obviously we want to avoid a sort of competitive feeling there and just get the best out of our consultants that we can to really focus on that question. So if you're going to be a scribe, keep it brief. It could be that one of the consultants also scribes and just literally scribes the couple of action points or points that the presenter decides they're going to take home at the end. What we don't want to get lost in really is the scribe, as I say, laboriously going back over the whole sort of thing, which can happen, I think, when you get sort of people in that role sometimes. There's more to say about the methods, of course, and we've got those in handouts so that people can really think about methods and how they might use the methods. So I think then if we just get on to just thinking about the model, we've already made the point about choice. Sometimes if you just let the presenter choose, they're likely to choose a method that will collude with their perspective rather than challenge it. So I think that's a useful thing to think about. We advocate that whenever feelings are mentioned within the process, that they should always be fully owned by the discloser of the feeling. A willingness to have a go and try at different methods. So that goes for the consultants and the presenter. You don't really want a group of consultants saying, "Oh, I hate role play," because that's not very helpful if that's what the presenter wants. You've got to get stuck in and give things a go. Some people talk about the zone of proximal development, i.e. the boundary between certainty and uncertainty, and push yourself a bit, but don't overdo it. Now, I've just asked the cat to give you her opinion on what she thinks about the model. She's just been talking away there, but obviously I can't translate cat language, so I'm afraid we're just going to have to guess at that. So putting it into practice, I think the pros, very structured model. I think it's helpful in terms of containing the supervisee and what they have to say. I think it works well in mixed groups across the organisation, from different divisions and parts of the organisation, rather than in a homogenous team where there might be pre-existing dynamics that might interfere with the process. It fosters independence because of the structure. Once you've learnt it, you can kind of take it with you and run the group themselves anywhere, rather than having a fixed supervision leader. Now, there are some cons with some of that, but we can think about that. And it helps to flatten out team hierarchies by really imposing another hierarchy on the top, which if that works well, that's great. And sometimes that might feel a bit odd for people if you've got the kind of chief exec in a scribe role and a fairly junior member of staff in the consulting role. But on the other hand, that could be an offering for great creativity and interest in that. But, seeing how the human beings react to that change might be a bit of a challenge at times. So I think we already said about the cons of running it in an existing established team where there are existing dynamics. I think we've already discussed the fact that individuals presenting may not choose the best method of looking at their issue. So I think we've got that going on. I think we've also got the trend of people tending to lean towards the conservative side in their choice of intervention. And that also some of the interventions need to be skillfully facilitated to work well. Now, we're assuming that just because we've got this menu of methods, that the consultants can all work comfortably within that menu of methods, and that obviously is often not the case. So really, if we're using this model well, the consultants all need to be trained. In fact, all the participants obviously need to be trained in the range of methods. Some of which are more obvious, but some of which are more difficult. So other things for anyone setting up peer groups to consider really are sort of fairly obvious, and I've sort of listed some of them here. Face-to-face, online, hybrid. Maybe you start as face-to-face and move to online after a while. Length of the group, at least an hour and a half. I would say even 2.5 hours. Helps then to offer some informal time, unwinding, eating, drinking time. Diversity of the group. To my mind, diversity is always health. So therefore, diversity in profession, diversity in division in the organisation, diversity in peoples, sort of ages, race, different, the more diverse a group you can get, I think the better, as long as they're all willing to sort of do some work in the supervision process. A common understanding of what the group is doing and why, getting to know each other, managing the task, reviewing on a sort of regular basis. So having a think that's not meant to be comprehensive, but just things to get off the ground. It's always going to take longer than you think to set a group up. To my mind, it takes 6 months to a year to set up a really good group. But then once the group is running and ongoing, it can run for years and be a really sort of safe and helpful place for staff to have a place to really think about themselves professionally and just really reflect.